right, cool. So diving on in, you can either put in the chat or you can just say it out loud. On a scale of 1 to 10, how comfortable are you asking for money? How comfortable are you coming into this training? Just anyone, just asking for money as a general rule. Let's see, I got a 6, I got an 8, got some 8s. If it's for a mission or org I believe in. Yeah, that's important. Okay, cool. So we've got lots of 6s and lots of 8s. So I don't see any 0s, but I also don't see any 10s. So that is good. All right, and then follow up. How comfortable are you asking individuals for money? So, face to face, one-on-one, human to human. Same thing. Oh, we got a 10. 10, 8. Okay, so those numbers are going up. Depends on the situation. Would anyone like to come off mute and just maybe comment on why it is that maybe they feel a little bit more comfortable asking?
That drive thing.
What was that? Yeah.
So
Oh, no worries.
So for me, I guess it's what the situation is asking for money. If it's something that they owe the food service program money and I'm having to track people down, or if they have a rough financial situation asking them for money. But if it's like looking for donations or looking for something like that as a fundraising thing, I have no problem asking for companies or people for money, just like give me your money and I accept donations.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that context is really important. I feel like especially in the type of work that some of us do, where folks, if you're asking for someone to pay a delinquent, bill or a debt, and that they might not have the resources, yeah, that can definitely be tough. Anyone else want to comment on why they feel, good or maybe a little less good about asking individuals for money?
I'm pretty good with storytelling than asking for money. I have done that before. I like to put some substance on it before I ask. People been saying I've been pretty good with it. Um, I yeah, so and then I also like doing, if it's a QR code or something like that, depends on the anatomy of the audience, It really depends on that too as well for me.
Great. Thanks for those. All right, last question. How comfortable are you asking a foundation for money?
With me, I'm very comfortable with asking a foundation, asking anybody in person or electronically, because I've always had work in advocacy, and then I've done work for the Census Bureau, where I'm asking complete strangers to reveal to me what they have in a IRA and things like that. So if I can muster through that, I can pretty much muster through asking people to donate for a cause or to a foundation, or even following up with, you owe us a debt, just being polite about it and business-like, but making it happen.
Great. Thanks, Rita. I'm seeing lots of 10. So it seems like generally this crew is more comfortable asking foundations than individuals. Any other just comments folks want to make about their level of comfort or discomfort in asking individuals or institutions for some cold
I
hard benefits?
have asked foundations for money, but I have usually we have a panel discussion or there's a story attached to it. Then I will ask. I don't ask per se, but they know what they're there for, a fundraiser. So I just attach a story with it. Or yeah, I'm pretty good with asking uh organizations, but not good for myself.
Mm. So it's easier to ask for money for a cause than it is to ask for money for yourself. Yeah, that's real. All right, well, thanks for answering those questions. So here are some of the common barriers to asking for money. Over the years, I know I've dealt with a lot of these. These have, come up in some of y'all's answers, but the, you know, most of us are here because we do have an organization or some type of a cause that we want to raise money for. It was mentioned that, it's a little bit easier to do that than, let's say, if you individually fall on hard times and need to ask for money. But, within nonprofit spaces, there's a lot of competition. Folks feel, um, it can be difficult to like with the Good Giving Challenge or on certain days, there's just a lot of people asking for money, and it can be hard to kind of compete across that. Scarcity versus abundance. This is something where, sort of internally we say like, well, people don't have that much money, so I don't want to be asking a lot. Nervousness, lack of confidence. There can sometimes be a difference between asking people for money or asking strangers. I don't know if folks have ever had a chance to, it seems like some people on here have asked strangers for money, but occasionally you get a person that's not particularly nice and might say really rude things to you over the phone or to your face. And, that can stick with you. Feeling unequipped. I saw some comments that said, they're, I feel comfortable asking a foundation for money, but I don't necessarily know what to say or what the best practices are. And then sometimes people just don't want to impose, right? They don't want to, and this can show up again if you're asking on behalf of a cause or on behalf of yourself. But, these are just some of the common barriers, and those are important to just keep in mind because, for each of these barriers, there's sort of a flip side to it. And those are common reasons why people give. So, I won't go over all of these, but, one of the things that always stuck with me over the years, and, I've been doing community organizing and fundraising for 15 years. And, I don't pretend to know it all, but I've definitely learned a couple things. And, one of the things that I've definitely learned is that you don't want to be paternalistic. And by that, I mean, you don't want to make decisions for people. You want to give them the opportunity to make their own decisions. And if we automatically make assumptions about people's intentions or why they do or do not want to do something, that takes the ability for them to decide away from them. And, it can suck to get shot down. It can be disheartening. It can be demoralizing. And the sort of fear of feeling those feelings can sometimes stop us or, have us again, sort of make those decisions on people's behalf. But giving is often a very fulfilling, gratifying experience. We're in the season of giving right now with the holidays. And, it's important to kind of sit with that and remember that people want to give. There's a lot of reasons. Some of them are emotional, right? People care about the issue. They want to feel that self-esteem boost. They want to feel like they're contributing to something bigger than themselves. And sometimes it's a more, I don't want to say transactional, but look, I love a good free t-shirt. And even just saying free t-shirt, it's like I'm giving money and in exchange I'm getting a t-shirt. And we can get into the psychology of quote unquote free things, but sometimes a little swag goes a long way. And it I feel really good when I wear that t-shirt because I know that I gave to something good. Sometimes people give out of loyalty, right? Like they know you, they trust you. So there's a lot of reasons why people give. The important thing here, I just want to, end with is that it's important to allow people to make their own choices. And they're not able to make those choices unless you give them that opportunity. And, there can be, sort of a fine line between giving someone an opportunity and badgering them, right? If someone says no, then you should always take no as a final answer. But unless they clearly say no, then you're not sure. And you should be able to engage with them and give them the opportunity. All right. Now that we've gotten through some of sort of the emotional barriers and or reasons why people give, let's talk a little bit about the types of fundraising. So like I said, we're not going to be able to get into detail on each of these. I mean, each of these buckets has, its own strategies and best practices. I'd say the thing that I definitely want folks to take away here is that if you've got an organization or a cause, especially one that you're going to be working with over a long period of time, the important thing is to diversify your portfolio, right? I'm sure folks have heard that term before. It's important to have more than one core fundraising strategy because times change, the economy changes. There are circumstances by which, let's say you get a foundation that gives you money over a long period of time, that foundation might change its priorities. Or, let's say you get a lot of your money from small dollar individual donations. What if the economy tanks, right? And suddenly folks have a lot less money to give. So, one of the pieces of advice that I would give is try and think of at least two core fundraising strategies that you want to invest your time and energy in, and then try and go deep in those. Now, obviously, there is going to be, there's a balance between how much capacity you have and, how many of these you're going to be able to do. The reality is that time is limited, resources are limited, and, most of us do not have a full-fledged development team with multiple people who can do all of these things. So, I'm going to touch on a couple of these. Most of what we're going to talk about here today is the foundation, the grant side of things, but I'll send out some resources, Robin will, afterwards that touch on a couple of these as well. But just to walk through them, so, we talked about individual giving. That can be small dollar, right? 5, 10, 15. That can be large dollar, thousands, tens of thousands of dollars from an individual. Member driven is when, you have a membership and usually there's dues. So every year you have to renew your membership. And as a part of that, there's a financial contribution. Crowdfunding is another kind of individual. It's not quite member, right? You don't become a member when you crowdfund. I'm sure many of us have given to a crowdfunding opportunity before. Sometimes it's when people hit hard times. It was mentioned earlier, like this one can be kind of tricky for you as an individual, right? It's a vulnerable thing to say that I need help and then ask, right, a whole bunch of people and just publicly say like I am raising funds for me or for my family. But sometimes people crowdfund for other folks. There's a lot of platforms, GoFundMe, Indiegogo, that have made this type of work really easy. But crowdfunding is probably as old as money. I mean, churches, tithing, that's a really OG type of crowdfunding. But individual, and we'll get into sort of why this is, but usually all individual donations are unrestricted, and we'll talk about why that's important. And so going down to foundations, these are, a foundation is it is an entity that is created when a large, pool of money is set aside. That money is normally invested into a thing and accrues interest. And then normally that foundation spends out the interest, some amount of it, and keeps the like main chunk of the money. Foundations can be small, they can be very large. Some foundations might, have hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some of them can have billions of dollars. And sorry, I'm just getting caught up on the chat. NPR, yes, NPR definitely gets that individual fundraising strategy. Whoops. Ah. Sorry, y'all.
The tech goblins got you.
Yeah, I am also getting over a sickness, so my ability to operate a keyboard apparently has been compromised. Now, I mentioned restricted versus unrestricted. Oftentimes when a foundation gives money, they say, we're going to give you money and we want you to do X, Y, and Z. Or, like, let's say you get a grant from a foundation to do child feeding, right? Feed kids. You often cannot feed elderly people with that money. And that is a restriction of the funding. Or, let's say you get money to, run a campaign to try and get some bill passed in the General Assembly. You probably can't spend that money on, hiring a fundraising staffer. Or, grants usually have, or historically usually have had some type of restrictions on them. And that can be hard when you have an organization, you've got a budget, right? There are a number of things that come up. Let's say your printer dies and you need to buy a new one. Well, you can't spend any of the money from that one grant because that grant is only for these types of things. I mentioned earlier the individual donations are usually unrestricted. Unrestricted means that you can do just about anything you want with them because the person gave you that money because they believe in like you or in the institution. Individuals can give restricted funds, right? They can give you a donation. They can say, I'm going to give this to you, but I want you to use it in this way. And, I won't get into the legalese too deep as far as, where do you sort of cross the line? But if you receive money and it has restrictions, you are often bound by those restrictions. And, if it's a foundation and you sort of violate the terms of that, they can claw the money back. If it's an individual, they could theoretically sue you. So it's one of those things where it's like you do want to be very cognizant of how you use restricted funds. And that's why, the individual fundraising can often feel like more work, but those unrestricted dollars when it comes to budgeting are really important. So that's what I meant about diversifying your portfolio. If you are only fundraising restricted funds from foundations, then that's eventually probably going to make things pretty difficult when it comes to balancing your budget. All right, so I'm going to run through the rest of these real quick. So an open call versus an invitation. If a foundation says like, hey, we're accepting applications for this grant, that's an open call. An invitation only, some foundations, they'll only give money to institutions that they proactively reach out to and say, we've heard about you and we want you to apply for our money. And, that one's tricky. We're going to get into how can you basically set yourself up to be able to receive those types of invitations. But Often I will tell people if there's a foundation that you like that funds good work, visit their website once a month, once every other month, sign up for their social media, sign up for their newsletter, and, to wait for when they have an open call. So that way you can jump on that opportunity. All right. Billable versus lump sum. We're getting really, really wonky on this one, but I'm not going to talk too much about like federal or public sector, state or governmental grants. But usually when you get money from the government, it's a billable grant, which means, hey, we're going to give you $500,000. That sounds great, right? But the only way you're going to get that money is if you spend it and then send us the receipts, and then we will reimburse you the amount that you spend. So, billable grants can look really great when they sort of, quote unquote, hit your books. But I mean, we've gotten billable grants before and we just weren't able to pull down all the money because, staff were stretched. Someone had to go on maternity leave. There is a number of reasons why you can't fulfill or do that full amount. And if you were budgeting that full 500,000 and you can only actually pull down 250, like, ooh, that might make things a little complicated. Lump sum is when the foundation or the entity is like, we're going to give you this whole chunk of money up front. Bam, here it is. And that obviously is a lot easier to work with. All right, and then I won't spend yes, billable grants are, oof. I'm not going to tell people to not apply for government funding. Often landing a government contract can be great. It can be a large amount of money. It can be a secure, like as chaotic as the government can be, like it's not going away anytime soon. But yeah, I mean, the amount of compliance and paperwork and follow-up, and you have to, upload every receipt and you got to log, every half second of your time. It can be pretty laborsome. And unless you have like staff time accounted for to be able to do all of that follow-up, I would really think critically about if you are going to apply for federal or state grants, because it can be very time consuming. And for folks that work in education, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here when it comes to getting those state and federal dollars. All right. Just to run through the rest of these, the rest of them are pretty straightforward. Well, donor advised funds and pooled funds, they're sort of like foundations, except usually they're a foundation of foundations. Like I mentioned, the organization that Maggie is a part of, and we'll get a little bit more into that in a second. Pretty much everyone's done an event-based fundraiser before. The bake sale, right? The classic example. You've got admissions-based, you pay $25 to get in, you pay $50 for a seat at the table. Then there's activity-based ones, right? You pay, let's say there's like a community fair, and you pay to whack the effigy of a clown with a hammer, and you pay to go on the merry-go-round, or whatever it is. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of events. You can be really playful, you can be very creative. It can be a great way to not just raise funds but build relationships within a community. And events can take a lot of planning and a lot of resources. So it's one of those things where you got to kind of think about, is the juice worth the squeeze? Sponsorships are interesting. We'll talk a little bit here in a second about those, but it's basically just some other entity saying, we want our logo slapped on the flyer, mention our name, we want to be a sponsor. And then raffles, charitable auctions, gamings. Bingo is the classic example. I remember in college, we used to raise funds for some LGBTQ rights organizations, and we would do drag bingo. And it was a good time. We raised a lot of money. There's games of chance, right? Bingo is a game of chance, but then there's also the highest bidder, right? So you get people to kind of bid and outbid each other. Similar to event-based, can be fun, can be creative, you can get silly, you can get artistic, and probably have to do a fair amount of logistics around it. All right. So, talking a little bit, a dunking booth, yes, for sure. Those are always fun. Or did y'all ever do the one where you had the heckler that you would throw tomatoes at? That was always pretty comical. All right,
I do always wonder about those big events, like the really big fundraiser dinners where it's like you buy a table, like how much money actually went into the event. Because I hear afterwards, I've never planned one, but they'll be like, we raised so much money. And I don't know if that total is taking into account like what they already spent on it, or if that's, have they done the math yet?
Yeah, and with events, it's inputs versus outputs, right? So if let's say you get the venue donated, let's say you get the food donated, let's say, because sort of events and sponsorships can converge here. Let's say, the Hilton is the sponsor, and the way they became a sponsor is they donated the ballroom, right? So, I mean, there are definitely ways to decrease the input costs so as to maximize the output revenue. And that's really just going to depend on the situation, what connections, what relationships you have. But I mean, there's definitely been event-based fundraisers I've been a part of before where we thought we were going to raise a bunch of money and we like only really just broke even because, we didn't get a lot of stuff donated or less than we thought, or, there just weren't as many people that showed up. So whenever you do something like that, you should always know what your break-even number is. You're like, we need 40 people to register in order to break even, which means we want 80 people to sign up. And that math is just going to be very dependent on the situation. All right. So starting to dig into the actual foundation side of things, there are a lot of different kinds. So this just shows the difference between grants and investments. So, I mean, the only real difference between a grant and an investment is that usually when you give a grant, there's not an assumption of a quote unquote like financial return on your investment. Besides that, they're pretty much the same. Now, the lines used to be a little bit, I think, more distinct in the past, where it's like an investment was for the private sector and grants were for the like philanthropic nonprofit sector. There's a lot of and this is where I'm going to start getting into some of the language of foundations and philanthropy. There are a lot of resource allocators that will invest in foundations, or private sectors might receive a zero interest loan, right? And so there's like, I guess I just wanted to say that to demystify that there's a lot of gray between grants and investments, and it really is just sort of like what's in the fine print. But the reason why I think it's important to understand the entity is just to figure out, what are their motivations and what do they want out of this? Because, if you are talking to, let's say, an impact investor, right? An impact investor might just be an individual or a group of individuals that have a lot of money and they want to put that money into something that's, strategic and will have a large impact. Let's say they're really concerned about maternal health in Montana and they want to invest $4 million into birthing centers to, you know, address the high infant mortality rate, right? Like they might have reasons that have to do with, like, you know, their own prerogatives, right? They want a healthier community. Maybe they want young families to be able to stay there so as to better the economy. Like, the difference between that and a community foundation giving a grant to birthing centers to address the same issue, there's not really that much difference. It's just that, you know, they might have a different way of giving that money and slightly different motivations and maybe some different back end stuff. You know, sometimes with investments, they do want a return on their investment, but not always. And that just has to do with, again, the sort of the fine print there. Yeah, and then, you know, some of the emerging trends, there is a lot of learning that's happening across philanthropy. And when I say sort of philanthropy, I'm mostly talking about foundations or individuals with wealth or access to wealth. And, you know, a lot of them are much more interested in systems change. So, you know, how are these things going to address these systemic issues over time, equity and justice? This one, obviously, you know, since the uprising and the murder of George Floyd, and then sort of the backlash to DEI that we're seeing, you know, the push and pull for equity and justice, especially around race and racism in this country, is as old as this country. But it's definitely something that a lot of funders and foundations are very keen to know, like, what is this organization doing to advance equity and or justice? Community-led funding, what does the community want? Are they involved? Are directly impacted people at the table? Is what you're asking me being informed by the actual humans? I mentioned paternalism earlier. You know, it used to be that a lot of philanthropy and foundations were pretty paternalistic, right? Like, we know best, we have the money, we have the resources, and, you know, we're going to say we're accepting grants for this campaign because we think this campaign is important. That's shifting a little bit. And I think folks in philanthropy are a little bit more willing, and in fact are asking for, you know, what does the community want? What does the community need? All right. And talking a lot, so I'm going to try and speed it up a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about just like the philanthropic sector. Who are these people? So this might surprise you, but corporations actually give a very small amount. For the most part, corporate sponsorships, corporate donations make up a very small amount of overall philanthropic giving. That's a larger question, a larger issue that we need to work on. Bequests are when someone dies and they say, hey, in my will, I want this money to go to this place. You can see here that foundations make up about 20% of overall philanthropic giving. Individuals make up more than 2/3. So I mentioned earlier sort of the balance between individual and philanthropic or foundation giving. Now, we'll get into sort of the individual breakdown in a second, but for the most part, foundations and individuals, that's where the money is. If we look at the individuals a little bit more, billionaires, surprise, actually don't give that much money. The ultra high net worth, so that's you're in the many millions of heirs, but not quite a billionaire, they give a fair amount. But overall, again, about 2/3, these are folks that are not considered super wealthy, and we will break down what that looks like here. So this is based on charitable deductions that people claim on their taxes. Real quick note, the majority of poor folk do not file their taxes. They don't have enough income to really make it make sense. And if they do file their taxes, they might not give enough to a tax, right, to a 501c3 nonprofit in order for it to make sense to claim the charitable deduction. So The only caveat I would make to this number is that first row for folks making under 50,000, it's probably a fair bit higher, probably at least 10 to 15%. So when you look at these numbers, that means that the folks that have the least give the most as a percentage of their income. But because they make so little, they just don't have a lot to give. So they are the most charitable. But when you're talking about, we only have so much time, and if, we were to get 100 people to donate $15, like that's great. But if you get 2 people to donate 10 grand, that's just gonna be more. So it is a balance between that. The people that give the second most are the most wealthy, people that make over $10 million or more a year. So the interesting thing here is that the people in the middle, between 50,000 to, a couple $1,000,000 a year, actually give the least. So it's interesting to think about, what do you want your strategy to be? Because it is easiest to raise money from those that have the least and for folks that have a lot of wealth. But there's also the most untapped resources in sort of those middle income brackets. This is just another way to look at it as far as the total amount. So again, this goes back to the folks that don't make very much, just don't have very much to give, even though they do give the most as a percentage of their income. Folks that have a lot more to give. All right. Now, race and racism in philanthropy is a well-established fact. The total sector-wide revenue for Black-led organizations, they receive less than $3 billion per year in philanthropy, compared to $85 billion per year for majority white-led. So Black-led organizations get about 4 to 8% if you're going to use the most liberal interpretation, which is very small. And furthermore, those unrestricted funds, which I mentioned earlier, 1/4. Black-led organizations receive 1/4 the amount of unrestricted funds. So not only do organizations that are Black-led receive less in philanthropic support, if they do receive it, it has more strings attached. And unrestricted funds are sort of a universal sign of trust, right? Where we're going to give you money, but we're going to not require you to really prove anything to us. We're just going to give it to you because we trust you. So this is a problem, and it's a problem that exists, and it's a problem that we need to navigate as a nonprofit sector and as we engage with philanthropy. I think it's simultaneously important for white-led organizations to figure out how can we be in allyship with Black-led organizations to change these facts, and also how can we be supporting and holding philanthropy accountable in a way where we don't alienate them, which is a tough line to walk, but we'll talk a little bit more about it. But the data bears out that, race and racism is a prevalent issue in philanthropy. Class is also a big issue in philanthropy. I mean, this seems kind of obvious, but it's something that we don't often talk about, right? Most grant officers, the actual gatekeepers on if you get the funding or not, if your email gets received or not, most of these folks have not grown up in persistent poverty and have probably never experienced hunger. And same thing for the benefactors, the actual folks that have the wealth, the money, of which they are the gatekeepers too. So it's a lot of white folks and a lot of wealthy folks that are holding this capital, these resources that we need for our organizations. And it is the amount of income growth for the most wealthy, and I'm sure this is something that many of y'all know, continues to go up. So it's an issue that we continue to grapple with. Now, how is it that we can hold these individuals accountable, hold them to task, while still acknowledging that they have a thing that we need, right? They have the resources. You know, I grew up poor. I grew up in trailer parks, and to this day, when I meet someone who's really wealthy, there's this like inner part of me, this sort of like hot, angry fire that will bubble up, and I just like there's just like I just don't like them, you know, like or that's this like sort of whisper inside of me just because how I was raised. And I have had to over the years sit with that, analyze that. But the most important thing is just talk about it, like talk about class, talk about the way you were raised, talk about how money makes you feel, talk about how wealthy folks make you feel. Because, you know, I regularly engage with wealthy people, and I understand that we all live at the intersection of privilege and oppression. None of us choose where we are born. We are just born into those circumstances. And a lot of wealthy folks also deal with other forms of oppression that are invisible to me. And, you know, only through sort of acknowledging the humanity and the dignity that we all deserve, I think are we able to hold each other accountable. But, you know, if if it if like giving and asking for money requires vulnerability, you know, I need to do that and I need to expect that from them. So it's a two-way street. Um, there's also, I put in here code switching, which is the term that some of y'all might know. But like, look, I grew up poor. I did not learn the language of wealth until I was an adult. And, you know, I have to be, sorry, I'm just checking my time real quick. So one of the things that I like to say, so even just using, so like when I grew up, we called like the rich folk, right? Like those, this is like those rich people. Um, if you sort of grew up in a middle income or, you know, you're in the nonprofit space, you know, funders is a term you might use, or, you know, folks with means. If you actually talk to folks who grew up in an owner class or a managerial class, they'll use terms like resource allocator, um, or, you know, talk about, oh, my brain's really fuzzy right now, folks with access to capital. So even just like the language that we use is, you know, depending on who you're talking to, like if I'm talking to like, you know, folks from a similar class background as me, I'm not going to use the term resource allocator because I'm going to sound pretentious. But if I am talking to folks, you know, a funder, Christy Brown, you know, in Louisville, whose family runs Brown Foreman, like I'm probably not going to refer to her as rich folk. So thinking about the language that you use and sort of who are you talking to. You know, another thing I want to mention here is the 10-80-10 rule. And this is true in organizing. It's also true in philanthropy. 10% of any group is just not going to be on your side. No matter how much you talk to them, no matter how much evidence you bring. We talked about race and class earlier. That certainly plays in here. But, you know, there's just going to be some amount of people that no matter what you do, they're not going to come around. There's going to be 10% of people who will always be on your side. You don't even have to do anything. All you have to do is say, hey, will you give to this? And they'll be like, yes, I got you. There's that 80% that's where you want to be thinking about, you know, is the juice worth the squeeze, right? You know, there are some of them who, with a small amount of effort, they'll come around. And if you have extra capacity, maybe you can get a good chunk of them. If you have less capacity, maybe you need to focus more on sort of the, more inclined side, but that's just going to be, I think, the unfortunate reality. I put trust-based philanthropy here. This is a trend within philanthropy where, again, like unrestricted funds, we want to trust you as the grantee. We want to give you more resources. We want to reduce the amount of reporting you have to do. But that's not all of philanthropy. Some of them still have these deeply restrictive parameters. And that's just going to be for you and your organization to kind of identify, is the amount that they're asking from us worth it? Or is it not? Like, are they falling into that less inclined side of the 10-80-10 rule? And it's just not even worth our time.
I will say though, even with the funders that have been a little more challenging as far as like what they require of us for reporting, or just all of the rules we have to follow, the actual people involved seem really on board with wanting to fund this work, and they're just kind of working with the norms that they're used to. So I think slowly, by working with some of those folks, we might be able to change their practices.
Yeah, and thanks for that point, Robin. The thing about accountability, and that's why I mentioned, treating people with dignity. And that I cannot speak for everyone. Sometimes people do and say things and they just deserve a big F you, right? Like what you just said was so out of bounds. Like we cannot be friends. But, especially with funders, they deserve for us to be honest. And that can be hard sometimes, right? Because there's a power imbalance, which is very real. It's very tangible. They have a thing that we need. But because here, I'll use this. This was told to me a couple years ago, and it always really stuck with me. If there's someone in your area of work, right, and they've been around for a long time, they've worked with a lot of people across your sector, they have a lot of wisdom and knowledge, and they've seen things fail, they've seen things succeed, and you have their contact info, right? Like you have access to them. Would you reach out? Like, would you contact them? Would you offer feedback, or elicit feedback from them? I think most of us would be like, yeah, like if I have the number of someone with all that information, like I'm going to do that. Now think, what if they were a funder? Does that change the way that you would interact with them? And if your answer is yes, then I need you to stop and think about, should it? I mean, obviously, there's some things you don't want to say to a funder, right? Like there's some friends that I have who, fit this model, who, like, I don't know, it'll be a Saturday and I just went out and had a drink or two and I text someone like a silly thing that I just saw. I might not do that to a funder, right? Like you got to be professional. But at the same time, like when people get forced into a box and they get sort of held at arm's length just because of the job that they have, that can be hard. And a lot of funders get treated that way, where it's almost like they don't get brought in because we don't want to, like, you know, ruin the relationship or do something that would make them not, like us, or it just gets weird. It gets weird when you're trying have a non-transactional relationship with a funder, because that transaction piece kind of gets in the way of the relationship. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But so into the actual, like, best practices here. So here are some steps for researching your funder. And within the philanthropic space, there's a term called due diligence, right? So when someone applies for funds at a foundation, the grant officer will do their due diligence. They will Google your name. They will look at the website of your organization. They will see, do you have news coverage, right? They'll do sleuthing, right? Which I guess I don't know if everyone knows that term, but like they will try and find all they can about you. You should do the same thing about your funder. You know, go to their website. What's their mission? What's the eligibility criteria? What's the strategic focus? Read their blog posts, right? Have they celebrated anything? Like really dig deep into who are they and what is the face that they're presenting on their website. Do the same thing for social media, right? What are they sharing? What do they think it's important to lift up? Look for their name, look at who they're following. Do you have connections to them? I have definitely found like oh, I didn't know that friend that I went to college with, like worked for this foundation 2 years ago. Like I should touch base with them to see what their experience was. Or, reach out to, and this is step 3, reach out to grantees, ask about their experience, right? Let's say their website looked great, their social media looks great, but then you talk to someone you trust and they're like, oh man, that was one of the hardest things. Like they were weird and it was awkward and they didn't get us our money until 6 months after they said they would, you know. So, across all of these, like, how do they present themselves on their website? What's their social media presence? But then what is the feedback from the humans that have interacted with them? And, don't feel, I mentioned earlier about the like cultivating non-transactional relationships. Feel free and contact a program officer and be like, hey, we're thinking about like applying. I saw your website. I love what you're doing. This is really good. We're just trying to figure out if we might be the right fit. It's like, don't be intimidated to do that. Like maybe they won't answer your email, but maybe they will. And I've had really great conversations with program officers before we ever applied or ever got any funding, just to figure out like, are we the right fit? Should I invest time and resources into even applying? All right, these are the essential questions. So we've gone over a lot of information, but I want to go back to just like some core questions here. Why are you raising money? Being very clear on the why is essential to any of this. Before you do any of what we talked about, any of the research, any of the, should we do an event? Should we go for a foundation? Should we get a donor advised fund? If you are clear on your why, and what I tell people is imagine you are, you get on a flight, you sit next to someone, and like that person next to you is going to give you money. You don't know how much. And it's not an elevator pitch, right? You have more than 60 seconds. You've got at least like 30 minutes. But can you be very clear on the like, why is this important and what are you doing? And I think, making sure it shouldn't really matter. It matters a little bit on the margins as far as maybe some of the words you use, but a $25 donation versus a $25,000 donation, like the why should still be pretty much the same. You shouldn't change your why so much that it is deeply different depending on the different groups of people you're asking. Because then it's like, well, are you actually committed to that thing if you're willing to be so flexible, so malleable about why it is that you're doing this? So be very clear on your why. And I've got this hilarious meme here, what if I told you if you make money the focus of your fundraising, it will make it harder for you to raise any? The money is a means to an end. The end is your why, right? Money is but a lubricant. It makes the thing happen easier, but it shouldn't be your final destination. And if you're only focused on the money and you're not focused on your mission and your values, you're probably going to have a hard time. And then who are you raising money from? We already went over some of that as far as, are we targeting small individuals? Are we targeting, this foundation that has a $2 billion endowment? For instance, the JPB Foundation, they just changed their name. Freedom Together Foundation. But JPB, now the Freedom Together Foundation, they have a $2 billion endowment. They fund pretty much every, quote unquote, progressive organization in this country. And they have a $2 billion endowment. In foundations, there is a rule. It's actually the only rule that they're held to. They have to give out at least 5% of their profit, of their resources per year in order to keep their status. So that means that, JPB has to give out $100 million per year. And they do. And they're just one foundation in this country. So, who are you raising funds from? Try and be clear on that. And then how? We talked about all those different types of activities. So the why, the who, and the how. All right, and we're about to get done with this, and then I'd love to entertain some questions. So what can you actually do? So I think it's really important to think about communications as an entry to philanthropy, right? We mentioned due diligence and researching your funder. They're going to do the same thing to you. And again, whether that's an individual, like how many of y'all have ever had someone ask you like, hey, can you give money to this thing? Or can you support this thing? And then you Google them and there's like no website and you're immediately like, or you look at their website and it's weird and it's clunky and it's like, I don't know, this looks like it was made on an HTML, in the 80s. Like I'm not sure about this. Now, you don't have to have, a multi-million-dollar website or anything, but it should look like someone is caring for it, right? People want to invest in something that looks like it's being cared for. So, think about your brand, like establish your voice. If someone Googles the thing, what's going to come up? And in there, some important things is some folks were mentioning storytelling earlier, really important. The data and the numbers are valuable. The things that people remember are the things that make them feel. And stories make people feel. It's that emotional piece that really sticks with you. So what are the stories? What's the feelings that people are going to get? And will they remember that feeling? Framing the impact, on the ground insights. These are things you want to make sure that are on the website, on your social media. And that's when I said it's important to get clear on the why. This is the why, right? The stories, the impacts, things that really articulate the work. Understand funder motivations, what drives they're giving, how does that connect to your brand? How can you align your approach with their goals? And this can show up, some on the, like I said, on social or on the website, but this is maybe a little bit more on, if you want to raise money from small dollar and large foundations, then think about, are there things that speak to both of them on those platforms? Or in communicating with those folks, have you tailored your pitch to be matching what, if they say on their website, this is who we fund and this is why, then make sure to tailor what you're saying to them around those parameters. Leverage opportunities and engage. This is important, oh, excuse me. Make sure and share, media placements, speaking engagements. If you're gonna go somewhere and do a thing, take a picture, put a little blurb up, right? It's always hard to remember those sometimes when you're like in the heat of it, but this shows that you're out in the community, you're doing the thing. And then, yeah, we already mentioned establish your online presence, virtual network. All right, this is the second to last slide, and then we'll get into your questions. When it comes to cultivating long-term relationships with donors, communicate regularly. Tell them about successes, share stories with them. Sometimes, the funders are rarely in our communities, right? So we can't assume that they're just going to know we're doing good work because they're not talking to our neighbors. They're not talking to our communities. They don't have those relationships. So how are they going to find out? Answer that question. How are they going to find out about it? And if they're not going to do it organically, that is your job to make sure that they are. And if you're only doing it once a quarter or once a year in your grant report, is that cultivating a long-term relationship? Seek their feedback. They can be partners. I mentioned that thing earlier about like, if you've got someone with a bunch of knowledge and a lot of expertise, like, would you reach out to them? Would you ask them like, hey, this thing came up and I'm not like really sure how to navigate it? Funders are great opportunities, resources to do that. And it's going to give them an opportunity to learn more about your work and to be able to, again, like everyone, I have never met someone who is like, I don't really like when people think I've got something to add. Everyone wants to feel like they have something to contribute. Give them an opportunity. Express gratitude, tailor your message. Don't be a brown noser, but also, say thank you. Like this work wouldn't have been possible without your support. Invite participation. I touched on that. Be honest and transparent. This is one that folks can, this can be kind of hard with funders, right? If something goes wrong, maybe you don't really want to tell your funder that because you're afraid that might mean that they will cut your funding in the future. And, I think this one, use your best judgment. But again, if you want a non-transactional relationship, it's going to require both sides to be vulnerable, and someone has to be vulnerable first. So if you reach out and say like, look, we tried this thing and it didn't work out, or it didn't go quite as the way we expected, use that as an opportunity to engage them. Like, hey, you've probably seen this before. What would you do? Or, like life. One thing that funders and people with wealth know, it's risk, right? If you have $1 million and you invest that $1 million, there's going to be some investments that don't return, right? That risk didn't shake out, but that's just a part of the reality, right? Not every investment is going to come to fruition, and they know that. So you should know that they know that, and that they're not going to view. You don't have to be right every single time. And honestly, if you put on that front, like we've got it, we've never failed. If I was a funder, I would think that's a flag because everyone fails at something. And that just means you're probably not being honest. All right. And then lastly, just a couple things you can do. LinkedIn. If you don't have a LinkedIn account, get a LinkedIn account. This is where a lot of funders are nowadays. Social media is always like morphing, but LinkedIn is kind of where the funders and professional networks are. And this is a great place to follow those foundations. They post a lot there. Follow their grant officers, comment on their stuff, read their reports. It's the social media platform, I would say, for philanthropy engagement. Subscribe to their newsletters. I tell people this with lobbying and legislators, like if you see someone do a good thing, shoot them a message. Be like, I saw that thing you did. I heard that thing you said. That was great. Good job. But also, it's also a good way to stay up on the funding opportunities, be brave enough. And then I mentioned this earlier, but dig into your class background and get comfortable with you. Authenticity is something that you really can't pay for. It's something that you have to do through your own personal journey. And funders need us. Like, they literally can't do this work without us. Like, we are essential for them existing. So, know that, own that power, and, only through kind of talking about it and digging into, where you came from, can you relate to where they come from? All right, so I went a little bit long, and I was hoping to save a little bit more time for questions, but as everyone who knows me knows, I'm a talker. So with that being said, are there any questions or thoughts that people have?
Now, I just want to say, proud of you. You went perfect amount of time because I was late. So I was like, hey, I still got some extra time. Woo-hoo. I think you did it really for me. Um, and you don't have to confirm nor deny these allegations, but that's my story and I'm sticking to it.
Thanks, Tanya.
I'm gonna agree with Tanya. You did amazing. Really awesome.
Appreciate you, yeah.
I will share a brief fundraising story that was a pleasant surprise. So KEJC was doing phone calls for the Good Giving Challenge, and it was very last day, so we were calling folks that hadn't donated yet but had in the past. And I was expecting more no's than I got. I only got one no, and 5 different people were like, "Oh my God, I completely forgot. Thank you. I want to give you my money." So that was really exciting that folks had just lost track of the date, and they were looking for places to put that money to feel engaged and feel like it was going to a good cause.
One of the things, so like right now, me and a handful of organizations are undertaking, I guess, a pretty audacious goal. We're trying to raise between 100 and 200 million dollars for basically like get community organizers lawyers, right? So folks that are doing organizing out in the community law, and the laws are often used against people trying to shift power, whether it's around police accountability or around food or around healthcare. And we, like, that might sound sort of alarming, right? Like, wow, that's a lot of money. That must be a lot of work. But funders, again, right? I mentioned JPB. They give out $100 million every year, and that's a single foundation. They are used to talking in large numbers, which folks that don't come from wealth might be intimidated by. So when you come to funders with a bold plan, but one that's backed by, like, look, we've had meetings, we've talked to people on the ground, we know this is necessary, we've done the work. Like, sometimes the answer, and I mentioned scarcity versus abundance, try and use an abundance mindset, right? Like, there's money out there and there's need. And you all can't do this work without us. And here is a plan. You might say no to our plan, but imagine the amount of foundations we're going to get in front of, and at least they'll, like, even if they don't give us money, they'll be like, oh, hey, y'all are that group that had that like really great plan, and you had like dozens of partners as a part of it, and you clearly have a lot of trust in your community. So, the other thing I just wanted to add, the like, don't be intimidated by large amounts of money, and ask for what you need. Don't negotiate against yourself, at least when it comes to foundations, right? If it's an individual, there's a little bit more, I think, care to be taken, right? If someone is going to feel like guilt about not having enough money, that, you know. But look, foundations have a bunch of money. It's literally a tax exempt write-off for wealthy people. That's what a foundation is. So ask for what you need. Don't negotiate against yourself. And know that KFAN is here to support you in any of this work. If there is a foundation you're interested in engaging, if there's a project you want to stand up, reach out to us and we're happy to help think about, you know, the editing process for the grant, or, you know, we might know a grant officer, we might have some connection. Use this network to do that work and to make those connections. All right, and we are over time. I'm happy to stay on if folks have like a specific question, but we'll send out the slides. I'll send out a couple of resources. Well, me and Robin will. And I appreciate everyone taking the time to join us.